Good does not become better by being exaggerated, but worse, and a small evil becomes a big one through being disregarded and repressed. The shadow is very much a part of human nature, and it is only at night that no shadows exist. Carl Jung stressed that an individual's proper goal is wholeness, not perfection. The path to a greater character, to a more effectual approach to life, lies in integrating those elements of our psyche that for too long have been repressed and denied, the elements that make up what Jung called our unconscious shadow side. What is it that most people deny and repress into their shadow? All that is deemed bad or immoral by society, all that is frowned upon by our family or peers, all the traits that, when initially expressed, were ridiculed, shunned, or met with punishment. But given that no moral code is perfect and no family or peer group is ideal, in adapting to the social world, we not only repress the destructive elements of our personality, such as our unbridled sexuality, anger, and untamed animal impulses, but we also repressed positive and life-promoting characteristics. Perhaps our assertiveness was frowned upon, our early attempts at creativity ridiculed, or maybe our competitiveness or ambition was felt by those close to us to be a threat. As a result of repressing elements of our personality into our shadow, we were made tame, obedient, predictable, perhaps likable, but at the cost of our vitality and psychological wholeness. In this video, we are going to explore how to integrate our shadow and analyze the connection between our shadow and greatness of self. For as Edward Whitman wrote, the shadow, when it is realized, is the source of renewal. When there is an impasse and sterile time in our lives, despite an adequate ego development, we must look to the dark, hitherto unacceptable side which has been at our conscious disposal. To begin, we must examine how our dark, hitherto unacceptable side can be a key to unlocking our potential. For doesn't conventional wisdom warn us that our dark side consists of a wickedness we need to overcome? But the connection between the integration of our shadow and the development of a greater character becomes clearer when we understand Jung's assertion that the integration of the shadow leads to self-reliance. This integration of the shadow leads to disobedience and disgust, but also to self-reliance, without which individuation is unthinkable. In becoming aware of the shadow, first as an intellectual concept and then via introspection and reflection, we seek to discover what our own personal shadow consists of. We awaken to a moral conflict, to the troubling idea that a portion of our personality is at odds with contemporary morality and with what our family, peers, and society judge as good and evil. The attempt to protect our personality, this recognition can motivate us to take a stance, with Nietzsche, beyond good and evil, and to examine the morality we have been socialized into. In undergoing such an examination, we are likely to discover how much hypocrisy, complacency, and fear underlie many of the moral injunctions we obey, and, furthermore, that ridicule and moral condemnation are often driven by envy. In response to this realization, we may feel the need to behave in ways less in line with the dominant moral code of our day, ways considered evil by social morality. It is not that we want to become evil in the sense of turning criminal or committing heinous acts against our fellow man, but evil in the sense of detaching ourselves from what we see as the flaws of our moral code, so we can reconnect with the parts of our personality we lost in our shadow long ago. As Erich Neumann, a student of Jung's, explained, the psychological analysis of any normal development will make it clear that if he is to grow up, it is not merely unavoidable, but actually essential that the individual should do and assimilate a certain amount of evil, and that he should be able to overcome the conflicts involved in this process. The achievement of independence involves the capacity of the ego not only to adopt the values of the collective, but also to secure the fulfillment of those needs of the individual which run counter to collective values, and this entails doing evil. Most people are horrified at the thought of questioning, or, heaven forbid, breaking the moral code they were socialized into. They believe the value judgments of good and evil imposed on them by their schooling, parents, peers, and society are written into the fabric of reality itself. They do not understand that morality, like a society, can be sick and in need of overcoming. And so, for the common man and woman, the existence of the shadow poses too great a threat to their fragile self-image, a self-image that was constructed over years of adjusting to who they thought others expected and wanted them to be. But in never mustering up the courage to confront the elements of one's shadow, it does not go away. Rather, it puts one in the unfortunate position of susceptibility to possession by its destructive side, to following in the tragic footsteps of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. For in public, most people are conscientious, moral, and moderate, but behind closed doors, in the comfort of hearth and home, their shadow at times turns them into marionettes, unconscious victims of addictions, strange compulsions, fits of irrational anger, and a myriad of other self-destructive behaviors. Man has to realize that he possesses a shadow, which is the dark side of his own personality, if only for the reason that he is so often overwhelmed by it. Or, as Carl Jung warned, by not being aware of having a shadow, you declare a part of your personality to be non-existent. Then it enters the kingdom of the non-existent, which swells up and takes on enormous proportions. If you get rid of qualities you don't like by denying them, you become more and more unaware of what you are. You declare yourself more and more non-existent, and your devils will grow fatter and fatter. As denying our shadow only renders us prone to possession by its destructive side, integrating our shadow into our conscious personality is crucial for our well-being. To gain some insight regarding how to do this, we are going to focus on the integration of one shadow characteristic many of us desperately need to integrate, that being our aggression. In modern society, the word aggression typically stimulates thoughts of violence and destruction. In other words, we focus only on one side of the aggressive coin. For there is a healthy form of aggression that is imperative not only to our psychological health, but to our survival. This form of aggression fuels our sense of self-ownership, emboldens us in the face of fear, and ignites the drive to explore and master the world outside us. And aggression is not necessarily destructive at all, or as the psychoanalyst Clara Thompson put it, it springs from an innate tendency to grow and master life, which seems to be characteristic of all living matter. Only when this life force is obstructed in its development do ingredients of anger, rage, or hate become connected with it. Unfortunately for many of us, the life force of aggression was obstructed throughout our development. Our displays of aggression, whether constructive or otherwise, were not met with encouragement or understanding, but with frowns, punishment, and even violence. And so, to adapt to our environment and minimize conflict, we learned to repress our aggression into our shadow side, and it thereafter became susceptible to anger, rage, and hate. Based on decades of experience with patients, the psychotherapist Alexander Lowen observed, many individuals have an unconscious murderous rage, which they feel they must keep buried out of fear of its destructive potential. Such rage is like an unexploded bomb, which one dares not touch. If we have repressed our aggression into our shadow, how can we integrate it in a way that alleviates our anger and propels us toward wholeness and greatness of character? The power of shadow integration. The integration of the shadow is not merely a psychological exercise, it is a transformation of the self. It demands a confrontation with all that we have buried, all that we fear, and all that, if left unchecked, could consume us. Yet, paradoxically, within this darkness lies our greatest potential. As Jung asserted, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Throughout history, mythology has served as a guide for understanding human nature, and in nearly every culture, we find stories that embody the struggle of confronting the shadow. Take, for example, the Greek myth of Theseus and the Minotaur. The Minotaur, a monstrous creature dwelling in the labyrinth, represents the repressed aspects of the psyche, our rage, our unacknowledged desires, our primal instincts. Theseus, armed with a sword and guided by the wisdom of Ariadne, ventures into the labyrinth to confront and slay the beast. This myth serves as a powerful metaphor for shadow integration. The labyrinth represents the complexity of the unconscious, and the Minotaur is the embodiment of the aspects of ourselves we fear and repress. Without courage and guidance, Theseus would be lost in the darkness, just as we are lost when we refuse to face our shadow. In modern times, this battle manifests in our everyday lives. The unexamined shadow does not disappear. Rather, it controls us from beneath the surface, leading to self-sabotage, projection onto others, or even outright destruction. The shadow and the persona, a constant battle. If the shadow represents all that is hidden within us, the persona is the mask we wear for the world. Society demands that we present ourselves in a manner that is acceptable, respectable, and in alignment with social norms. But the wider the gap between the persona and the shadow, the more unstable the individual becomes. This can be seen in the many public figures who project an image of moral superiority while secretly engaging in the very behaviors they condemn. Take the example of religious leaders caught in scandals, politicians advocating for virtue while engaging in corruption, or even the everyday individual who preaches kindness while harboring deep resentment. The more we deny the shadow, the more it seeks to express itself in unconscious, destructive ways. Freud called this process repression, and Jung expanded upon it, warning that what we repress does not vanish, it festers. If ignored for too long, the shadow emerges not as a controlled force but as a possession, leading to extreme behaviors. This is why those who deny their aggression become passive-aggressive, those who suppress their sexuality become obsessed with purity, and those who disown their ambition sabotage those who strive for greatness. Consider the story of a businessman who, from childhood, was taught that ambition is selfish and that true virtue lies in humility and service to others. Wanting to be seen as good, he represses his desire for power, influence, and success. He dedicates himself to charity, working tirelessly for the well-being of others. Yet, beneath this altruism lies an unacknowledged resentment, an anger at the world for not recognizing his sacrifices, a bitterness towards those who achieve success without guilt. Eventually, this suppressed ambition mutates into passive aggression, manipulative behavior, or even outright sabotage of others. Had he acknowledged his shadow, his deep desire for success and power, he could have integrated it in a way that was both productive and ethical. Instead of resenting those who achieved success, he could have allowed himself to pursue his own ambitions openly, rather than cloaking them in false virtue. The fear of owning the shadow. One of the primary reasons people resist shadow work is the fear of what they might find. It is far easier to believe in one's moral purity than to acknowledge the potential for evil. However, as Jung stated, the difference between a good man and a bad man is the choice of cause. Every human being is capable of destruction, cruelty, and deceit. The question is not whether these impulses exist within us, but how we choose to channel them. The warrior who acknowledges his aggression can wield it in defense of his values. The entrepreneur who recognizes their ambition can harness it to create and innovate. The artist who embraces their darkness can use it to produce works of profound depth. But those who deny these impulses often find themselves controlled by them in ways they do not understand. The shadow and creativity. Many of history's greatest artists, writers, and musicians have produced their finest work through an engagement with their shadow. Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, Van Gogh, and even Carl Jung himself were deeply aware of the darker aspects of human nature. Their willingness to explore suffering, madness, and contradiction allowed them to create works of staggering insight. Consider the works of Fyodor Dostoevsky. His characters, from Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment to Ivan Karamazov in The Brothers Karamazov, are deeply flawed, tormented by their inner conflicts. Yet it is through these conflicts that profound truths about human nature emerge. Dostoevsky understood that the path to wisdom does not lie in avoiding the shadow, but in confronting it head-on. This is also evident in modern film and literature. The most compelling characters are not those who are purely virtuous, but those who struggle with their darker impulses. Walter White from Breaking Bad, Anakin Skywalker from Star Wars, and even Batman are all examples of characters who wrestle with their shadow selves. Their internal conflicts make them relatable, for we too experience these struggles. How to begin integrating the shadow? If we accept that integrating the shadow is crucial for personal growth, the question becomes, how do we begin? 1. Observe your projections. One of the easiest ways to identify shadow traits is to examine what we dislike in others. Jung suggested that what we despise most in others is often a reflection of what we have repressed in ourselves. If we find ourselves particularly irritated by arrogance, it may be that we have denied our own need for self-assertion. If we detest those who are openly ambitious, It may be that we have suppressed our own desire for success. 2. Examine your childhood conditioning. Many elements of our shadow were formed in childhood. What traits were you punished for? What behaviors were you encouraged to suppress? By reflecting on these questions, you can begin to uncover aspects of yourself that have been hidden for years. 3. Pay attention to your dreams. Jung placed great emphasis on dreams as a way to access the unconscious. Often, the shadow reveals itself in dreams as figures that evoke fear, disgust, or discomfort. Rather than dismissing these dreams, one can use them as a tool for self-reflection. 4. Engage in creative expression. Whether through writing, painting, music, or another medium, creative expression allows us to engage with our shadow in a constructive way. Many of the world's greatest artists channeled their darkness into their work, transforming suffering into beauty. 5. Develop assertiveness and boundaries. If aggression has been repressed, integrating it does not mean becoming violent. It means learning to assert yourself. It means saying no when necessary, standing up for what you believe in, and refusing to be manipulated. 6. Question your moral assumptions. If you have never questioned the morality imposed upon you, you may be living under values that suppress rather than empower you. This does not mean abandoning morality altogether, but rather developing a moral framework that is authentic and aligned with your deeper nature. The path to wholeness. The integration of the shadow is not a one-time event, but a lifelong process. It requires continual self-reflection, the willingness to challenge assumptions, and the courage to embrace complexity. Yet, those who embark on this journey find themselves transformed. They become more authentic, more powerful, and more capable of shaping their own destiny. To deny the shadow is to live in illusion. To embrace it is to become whole. The necessity of facing the shadow. For most individuals, the shadow remains an unconscious force, lurking beneath the surface of everyday life. Yet ignoring it does not make it disappear. Instead, it festers, waiting for an opportune moment to manifest, often in destructive or self-sabotaging ways. The more we repress it, the more it seeks expression through outbursts of irrational anger, addictive behaviors, depressive episodes, or compulsions we cannot explain. Psychologist Carl Jung believed that integrating the shadow was not a luxury, but a necessity for a well-balanced life. He warned that those who refuse to confront their shadow risk being controlled by it in unconscious ways. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Many people assume that their failures, struggles, or internal conflicts stem from external circumstances, bad luck, societal oppression, or the mistakes of others. While external factors do play a role, the more significant and often neglected source of our suffering lies within, the parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. To integrate the shadow, one must first summon the courage to face it. This is no easy task. It requires brutal honesty and a willingness to examine parts of ourselves that may be ugly, uncomfortable, or deeply unsettling. But as Jung pointed out, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The shadow in myth and religion. Throughout history, mythological and religious traditions have served as guides for understanding the human psyche. Many of these stories emphasize the necessity of confronting one's inner darkness before achieving wisdom, transformation, or greatness. One of the most striking examples is the ancient Egyptian story of Osiris and Set. Osiris, the wise and just ruler, is betrayed and dismembered by his jealous brother Set, who represents chaos and destruction. Osiris's son, Horus, must eventually confront and defeat Set in order to reclaim balance and order in the kingdom. However, before doing so, Horus must integrate the qualities of both his father's wisdom and his uncle's raw, untamed power. This mirrors the process of shadow integration. One must not simply banish the dark, destructive forces within, but learn how to wield them for a greater purpose. In Christian tradition, we see a similar theme in the concept of Christ's descent into hell before resurrection. The journey into darkness is not a mistake. It is a crucial part of transformation. It suggests that true strength and renewal come only after confronting the most terrifying aspects of the self. In modern storytelling, this same principle is reflected in the archetype of the hero's journey. Whether it is Luke Skywalker confronting Darth Vader, who represents both an external threat and his own potential for darkness, or Batman embracing the fear and darkness within himself to become Gotham's protector, the message is the same. Greatness requires the integration of the shadow. The refusal to integrate the shadow does not merely lead to psychological imbalance, it limits personal growth in every aspect of life. If we fear ambition because we were taught that wanting too much is selfish, we will never achieve our potential. If we suppress our anger because we were conditioned to always be polite and accommodating, we will find ourselves constantly exploited or resentful. If we deny our sexual nature because of guilt or shame, we may develop dysfunctional relationships or secret compulsions. By integrating these aspects into our conscious awareness, we regain control over them rather than allowing them to control us. We become more decisive, more confident, and more capable of asserting ourselves in the world. We no longer allow societal conditioning or past traumas to dictate our behavior. Instead, we reclaim lost parts of ourselves and use them to forge a stronger, more complete identity. Practical methods for shadow integration. Understanding the shadow intellectually is only the first step. True integration requires action. Here are several effective methods. 1. Journaling and self-reflection. One of the most powerful tools for shadow work is writing. Keep a journal and ask yourself difficult questions. What traits in others do I despise the most? When have I acted in ways that I later regretted? Are there aspects of myself that I try to hide from others? Do I have recurring fantasies or daydreams that I find disturbing? By writing down your honest answers, you begin to bring unconscious material into conscious awareness. 2. Observing emotional triggers. Pay close attention to what makes you angry, envious, or deeply uncomfortable. Often, the traits we most resent in others are the ones we have repressed within ourselves. If we loathe arrogance, perhaps we have denied our own need for self-confidence. If we envy those who are wealthy and powerful, perhaps we have suppressed our own ambition. By examining these emotional reactions, we gain insight into what aspects of our shadow need integration. 3. Safe expression of repressed traits. If you find that you have suppressed aggression, find a healthy outlet. Engage in martial arts, weight training, or assertiveness training. If you have repressed your creativity, set aside time for artistic expression without fear of judgment. If you struggle with expressing your desires, practice speaking your truth in low-stakes situations before applying it to more significant aspects of your life. Confronting fear and discomfort. Many aspects of the shadow are linked to fear. Fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of judgment. The best way to integrate these parts of ourselves is to move toward that fear rather than away from it. If we fear public speaking, we should find opportunities to practice it. If we fear confrontation, we should learn to engage in difficult conversations. Growth happens at the edge of our comfort zone, and the shadow often resides in the areas we avoid the most. 5. Therapy and shadow work techniques. For those struggling with deep-seated trauma or repression, professional therapy can be a valuable tool. Jungian therapy, in particular, focuses on shadow integration and can help individuals safely navigate the complexities of their unconscious mind. Other techniques, such as active imagination, a Jungian method of dialoguing with one's inner parts, dream analysis, and guided meditation, can also be effective. The power of an integrated self. A person who has successfully integrated their shadow is not a slave to their impulses, nor are they bound by the constraints of social conditioning. They are free. They can be kind without being weak, ambitious without being ruthless, assertive without being aggressive. They can stand alone, unshaken by the judgments of others, because they have confronted their own darkness and emerged stronger. This is the true path to greatness, not in the superficial sense of fame or material success, but in the deeper sense of wholeness and self-mastery. In a world where most people are ruled by unconscious fears, hidden desires, and social pressures, the individual who has integrated their shadow stands apart. They possess a quiet confidence, a resilience, and a depth of character that is unmistakable. As Jung himself wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." By integrating our shadow, we reclaim the full spectrum of our humanity. We break free from societal programming and rediscover the raw, untamed power within us. We awaken to the truth that greatness is not about perfection, but wholeness. And in doing so, we take the first steps toward becoming the person we were always meant to be. Embracing the shadow as a source of strength. If we are to integrate the shadow, we must also be willing to see it not as an enemy to be feared, but as a source of strength. What we repress does not simply disappear. It lingers in the depths of our psyche, influencing our behavior in ways we often fail to recognize. The more we ignore it, the more power it accumulates, waiting for moments of weakness to break through in uncontrolled bursts. But what if, instead of fearing this side of ourselves, we saw it as a wellspring of energy, creativity, and resilience? The great figures of history, artists, warriors, visionaries, all had an intimate relationship with their shadow. They did not seek to eliminate it, but to harness its energy and direct it towards something meaningful. Take, for example, the story of Heracles, the greatest hero of Greek mythology. His strength was legendary, but his greatest enemy was not an external force. It was his own inner darkness. Under the influence of a divine curse, Heracles committed an unforgivable crime, slaughtering his own family in a fit of madness. Overcome with guilt, he could have allowed this act to define him, to break him entirely. But instead, he chose the path of redemption, channeling his strength into the famous 12 labors, each one a symbolic conquest of his own inner demons. His legend is not one of perfection, but of a man who, through suffering and struggle, integrated his shadow and emerged whole. Heracles' journey teaches us a vital lesson. Our shadow holds destructive potential, but if confronted and mastered, it can be the source of our greatest transformation. Those who achieve greatness are not the ones who suppress their darker urges, but the ones who transmute them into something higher. Repression and its consequences. When we refuse to acknowledge our shadow, we fall into dangerous patterns of self-deception. We become fragmented, divided against ourselves, and ultimately weaker in character. Instead of dealing with our hidden impulses constructively, they leak out in unconscious ways: passive aggression, self-sabotage, addictions, and unexplained emotional outbursts. A man who represses his assertiveness under the guise of being nice may find himself constantly manipulated by others. He avoids conflict, seeks to please everyone, and suppresses any feelings of anger or dominance. But over time, this repression builds resentment, and one day, it may erupt in an uncontrollable rage, surprising even himself. Or it may take the form of quiet self-destruction, depression, anxiety, or chronic dissatisfaction with life. Psychologist Carl Jung once warned, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." This means that unless we bring our hidden traits into awareness, we will remain trapped in self-defeating cycles, believing that our misfortunes are the result of external circumstances rather than our own unresolved conflicts. Consider the case of the medieval knights, who were trained in the art of war, but also in the cultivation of virtue. Their code of chivalry was not about eliminating aggression, but mastering it, channeling their warrior instincts into the service of a noble cause. A knight who failed to integrate his shadow either became a mindless brute, using violence recklessly, or a coward unable to act when the moment demanded courage. Likewise, in modern society, many struggle with a failure to integrate their inner darkness. Those who suppress their ambition may find themselves stuck in mediocrity, resenting those who dare to rise above. Those who deny their sexuality may develop unhealthy obsessions, seeking fulfillment in distorted ways. The shadow does not vanish simply because we refuse to look at it. It waits, growing stronger in the dark corners of our mind until we have the courage to face it directly. The shadow in leadership and power history is filled with examples of individuals who have either mastered their shadow or been consumed by it. The difference between a great leader and a tyrant is often their ability to integrate their darkness. Julius Caesar, for instance, was not a man without flaws. He was ruthless, ambitious, and at times willing to break the rules to achieve his goals. But he was also a man of vision, discipline, and extraordinary charisma. His ability to balance his shadow made him one of the most influential figures of all time. Had he denied his ambition, he would have remained an obscure nobleman in Rome. Had he surrendered completely to his darker impulses, he would have been a mere despot, forgotten by history. On the other hand, We see figures like Joseph Stalin, who failed to integrate his shadow in a balanced way. His paranoia, cruelty, and unrestrained hunger for power turned him into one of the most feared dictators in history. His inability to face his own fears led him to project them onto the world, resulting in mass purges, terror, and suffering on an unimaginable scale. What separates the great from the tyrannical is not the presence or absence of darkness, but the ability to control and direct it toward a higher goal. Those who refuse to acknowledge their shadow become slaves to it, whereas those who embrace and integrate it become masters of their fate.